So I've been looking at the sled, and I just feel like something's missing. A lot of real estate there. What could be missing? Ah, there it is. Found it! So if you know me, you know I like Boost, and I just couldn't resist. I found a great deal on a used kit, and it came with a lot of goodies. I'm gonna go over everything in the kit, and a little install video, and at the end I'll tell you if I think it was worth it. So this is a 2020 Summit SP. It's got the shot start, and this kit was off a 2019. Same setups, got the T3 3-inch lugs, 165 track. So I'm hoping everything's the exact same, should be, but we'll see how it goes. So Boost It makes this turbo kit. It's a really nice kit actually. Garrett turbo, this is a 2860 RS. It's got its own closed loop oiling system. So you just top this up with your XPS Skidoo 2-stroke mix oil. It's got its own little pump and completely closed loop. You're not hacking up your stock oil injection lines on the sled. It's a really nice setup. Moving over to the other components of the kit, you got your fuel commander here, your tuning module. It comes with a boost controller as well, little manual T. I got the air fuel ratio O2 sensor. Got a couple gauges here. Comes with a blow-off valve. This is kind of cool because it recircs back into the intake system. Not the pressure side, just where your vents are on the hood. And actually, they claim it's supposed to blow off any extra snow and ice buildup, so your intakes don't get plugged up. Moving over to the intercooler. So this is an air to water system. So this plugs right into your throttle bodies. It's got your two secondary injectors. It actually has an intake air temperature sensor as well. And your air to water system on the back. So this is actually going to be filled with coolant, and it's got its own little deck in here. And there's the intercooler. So this is going to go under the tunnel, and they claim it's supposed to drop intake temps by 200 degrees Fahrenheit, which is huge. This is the little intake horn going up to the factory intake. This is your charge piping. Kit came with clutching, primary, secondary springs, different ramps and weights. So it should be a really nice kit. It was one of the more expensive ones on the market. So I'm excited to see how this all bolts up. So first things first, pop off the hood quick. You just got a couple of Torx bits here. You pop your cluster out. Torx bits there, the two up top, and then your one intake, you can use a screwdriver in there, and the hood just pops right off. So a little better shot here. The exhaust and the turbo is going to be the easy part. I think the intercooler and the clutching is going to be the most challenging. There are a couple specialty tools you need for the clutch, but we're going to try and work around it. So a little before and after. So these pipes are pretty easy. You just got the one EGT sensor plug right here, and then two little springs holding this guy on. And there's a couple of little tabs there at the bottom. It just pulls right out. Easy peasy. All right, so got the exhaust out of the way. The pull cord. So it's just one Torx bit here, and then the handle comes off. Run it down, get it out of the way. And then there's a little clip here for your chain tension on your chain drive. So I backed it out 12 turns and then reinstalled the clip. That gives you enough space to drive the secondary clutch out the other side, but make sure you catch this sprocket. I just used an extension, 3/8 drive, and it worked pretty well. It was almost the exact same size as the Skidoo driver would be, and it'll save you a little bit of money. But if you don't catch the sprocket, when you drive the secondary out the other side, you're taking your whole chain case apart to get that sprocket out. So you don't want that, it's a lot of extra work. And you can see the secondary comes out the other side. There is one little retaining clip here that you'll have to take out before you drive the whole secondary clutch out. And this is what the clutch looks like. So that's where we were driving on the other side of the chain case. And you kind of just drive this bearing out the other side. This is where that little mounting clip went. So make sure you take this off before you start beating on it. All right, so getting pretty close now, down to the throttle bodies there. And you can see the stock injectors, they're gonna stay. So we got secondary injectors in the new intake manifold. So this is the stock manifold. You can see just a couple clamps there. And that goes up to the hood. And a couple of wiring harness connectors there. Just cut some zip ties and she comes right out, nothing else attached to it. All the fuel components stay on the throttle body side. And then the pyramidal frame supports, there's just a couple Torx bits on those and a couple connections by the fuel tank, and the fuel tank slides back. Nothing too special there. So now the fun part, we're gonna take this tank right off, and the intercooler is gonna be the hardest part. So I just wanted to give you a close-up look at this intercooler. Because a lot of kits don't come with these. A lot of guys say you don't need them. That's kind of true. I mean, it depends on your riding style. These two-stroke sleds, if you run in a turbo setup, they're really hard on reeds if you don't have an intercooler. If you like doing long pulls, you don't cool it down frequently, you're gonna be burning through reeds once a season if you're lucky, probably. This intercooler setup has a super thick core. And yeah, like I said earlier, if it can actually drop your intake temps 200 degrees Fahrenheit, that would definitely save your reeds. You could run more ignition timing, you could run less octane fuel. It's just better all around. Your engine's gonna last longer. This thing is awesome. It's thick. I think it's gonna work really well. So I got the intake mounted, and now you can see the blow-off valve here. So this connects to the stock intake on the hood. So normally you're running boost, this valve is closed, so nothing's coming in the normal way, like a stock intake would. And then when you let off the throttle, this valve purges out the intake, and that's why they're saying it bursts the snow and ice off your intake, so it should keep it cleaner, longer. It's probably not perfect, but that's a cool idea. I like how that's set up. And then coming around to the back, you got the water pump and everything. And you can see where I'm gonna have to drill through the tunnel here. So that's kind of firing straight down. I got my vac lines coming off the blow-off valve here. So that's getting manifold pressure. And then I have a T here, and it's running to my control box. So coming around to the other side here, you can see the harness going into the box, the fuel commander there, and then a couple wires going up to my gauges up top. We're also going to need to run a vac line straight to the boost gauge. And then this guy, coming with the harness, is going to plug in to the oil pump off the turbo here. Running right to the oil pump. And then of course you got the AFR gauge. AFR gauge here. All right, so just bolting up the heat exchanger here. So what I did, I drilled some holes in the front of the tunnel kind of have it centered. This plug is perfectly centered, so that gives you a reference point. And if you line it up kind of with your factory intake grommets, it works pretty well. There is this little plastic piece you'll have to take off. It's kind of just like a little bracket for your intake grommet and wiring harness. But after you trim that, I kept half of it just to secure the brake line and everything here. And then I pushed the heat exchanger up from the bottom side and just lightly used vice grips to hold it in place. And then I just use anything you have to kind of perch that heat exchanger up in the center there. And now I'm gonna start drilling my holes up top. So I had a couple of little pinholes here before, just to show me where center is on that heat exchanger. And then we'll throw some rivets through it. So I've got a couple holes drilled. You can see I got 2 rivets already installed at the back. So you pretty much have to do the rivets so that you don't have bolts sticking up when you slide your fuel tank on. But I'll show you what it looks like. Here's a good angle. You can see if you're not careful, you can hit the track with your drill bits, but it's not too bad. So just take your time. And while everything's apart, it's a great time to do your fuel filter. Sitting right there. So Skidoo uses these stupid crimp style clamps. It's a good idea to get the worm gear style so you can reuse them. You're not constantly going through clamps. But yeah, installing the turbo, you definitely want to make sure you don't have any fuel restrictions. If you lean these things out, they will blow up. But a little bit of maintenance goes a long way. So I do apologize, I didn't get as much footage of the install as I wanted to, and I kind of got caught up with just getting things done. But I wanted to address some questions I had along the way and help you guys out if you guys were having similar questions. So my first question was, which fuel lines do you tie into? And if you come here, so this is your stock fuel rail. And this line, right here on the end of the rail, went back to a Y fitting right in front of the fuel filter. So if you come to the other side, so I just teed in right in front of the fuel filter. And one T goes to my secondary fuel injectors, and then I ran it up back to the original fuel rail, and then it's on the filtered side towards the front of the engine, so you're still getting filtered fuel. Both primary and secondary injectors are on the same circuit now, so that worked out well. The other thing I wasted a lot of time with was the blow-off valve. It sounds simple, but on 2 strokes, there's not really, well, on these fuel injected ones anyways, there's no vacuum lines on the engine side between the throttle bodies and the engine to get a clean vacuum source. So if you're familiar with most 4-stroke applications, coming right off the blow-off valve, you're gonna have your vacuum line, and this would be on the engine side of your throttle bodies to get true vacuum. But this, so I was talking with the previous owner, and he installed it. It's tapped into manifold pressure right now, so it's never really gonna see that much vacuum because it's not behind the throttle bodies. I didn't know if this was gonna work, and there's been a lot of debate on it if you look online, a lot of forums and stuff. There's just nowhere to tie into on these engines. So my vacuum source is tied in right here on the opposite side. You can't see it, but so that's getting your intercooler, the tube pressure coming right off the turbo. So that's always going to be atmospheric pressure or boost pressure. It's never really going to be vacuum. A lot of these blow-off valves are adjustable. This one's not. All the two-stroke guys say just make the spring as soft as possible so that you don't have to rely on that much vacuum to open the valve. I was on the fence if this was going to work at all, not really being tied to vacuum, but I've talked to a couple guys that have installed these kits before and they say it does work. So I'm going to try it out and maybe save you guys some hassle in the future if you guys are installing a kit like this. But yeah, a lot of the kits look like they tie in just to manifold pressure. So hopefully it works. And then moving over to my boost controller. So this will work good because it's tied right to the wastegate of the turbo, and my back line here, where I'll be getting my boost pressure from, is right off the turbo as well. So all this does is just a manual valve with spring tension, and if you want more boost, you crank this up and it just causes more spring tension and more resistance, and it's basically just cheating what the wastegate is going to see. So if this is set to 5 pounds, which I think it is, the spring inside the wastegate, it's going to open up at 5 pounds, and this turbo is only going to make 5 pounds of boost. It's not going to keep spinning faster. If you crank up this boost controller, this can add resistance, and say I want 8 pounds of boost. I can keep cranking this up until this makes about 3 pounds resistance, and the turbo will keep spinning. This wastegate's still gonna think it's making 5 pounds, but from the added resistance in the circuit, it's gonna be making 8. I do really like the closed loop oil system with its own little oil pump. That's a really nice feature if you're looking at a used kit or even a new kit, so you're not hacking up your factory oil injection lines. A lot of kits want you to cut up your oil injection lines and tee into the factory oiling system, which is okay, I guess, but if you ever wanted to take it out, you're gonna have to replace all your factory lines, and it'd be a little bit of a hassle too. All right, and the other stupid little thing that I wasted a lot of time on was wiring this fuel controller in. So I thought it originally stole power from this harness here, which ties into your ignition system, but it's not what actually feeds it power. There's 2 plugs that are exactly the same as your EGT sensor. So keep your EGT sensor plugged in to the factory harness on the body side of the sled. So that doesn't change. Originally I had this box plugged in to my EGT sensor and it didn't work. So that EGT plug, there's a blank plug on the bottom of your bezel here that's not used, but the harness side is for that fuel controller. So this is what's actually giving that controller power. Hook it up like that, you won't have any issues. I didn't realize that that blank plug was used or usable at all, so yeah, I wasted a lot of time just trying to figure out the wiring on that. One other little tip, I was fighting with the secondary clutch to try and get it back in, and the 15 mil bolt tied up in the case here. So when I was pushing this secondary clutch back in, the bearing wasn't sitting flush into this mounting bracket. So that bracket's pretty long and it actually flexes a little bit at the top when you're pushing on it. So as it was flexing, it was starting to kind of pivot at a bad angle. So what I actually did, because I was struggling to get that in, I had just a little pry bar in between the cylinder head and the top of the bracket, and just barely put pressure on this bracket back towards the secondary, and it slid in super easy. So just a little tip when you're going back together. And I already did the secondary helix spring in there. It wasn't that hard to do. The stock spring, you can compress this by hand when it's off the sled, this piece here. And you just need to compress this center piece enough to take these Torx bits out. You're gonna have to heat these up because they are Loctited in. Make sure you add Loctite going back in as well. Take those out and then release tension from this helix piece. There's just one spring under there. There's a plastic washer between the outside of this helix and the spring. Make sure you don't lose that washer, but that's all it is, just the one spring in there. I'm gonna try and film the primary because that's more involved. We have ramps, weights, and another spring to go in there as well. So I'll try and get some better footage of that. And I am doing all of this without any specialty tools from Skidoo. Obviously it would be easier to do it with the tools, but in a pinch, it's doable without. So the Skidoo tool for your secondary actually threads into the center of this shaft and then compresses the spring. And this back side of the secondary actually slides. So what I did is just took this to a buddy that had a press, and the piece at the back, the long shaft that goes into the chain case, literally just stood on the floor, and it stood up pretty high. And you could use anything, but just something to press this cone just a little bit to take the tension off of it. And that's all you need to get the Torx bits out of the back side. And then it comes apart super easy. You could probably rig something up at home too. It's not that hard. Like I said, when this is off and this collar's off, you can compress this by hand. Like there's almost no tension there. You just need even a second set of hands. Could probably compress it while you take the Torx bit screws out of the back. If you guys are installing an AFR gauge to keep an eye on field trims, which I would highly recommend if you're boosting your sled, they're pretty easy to wire into. So all I did was that one connector that was going to my blank plug, right, where I was stealing power from my fuel controller, like I said earlier. Just one power wire. You can tee in there. So that's just a power and ground circuit, tee into the red circuit. And then my ground, I just chassis grounded it. That's just a little bracket for the brake hose here that runs up to your bars. And that actually worked really well to ground it. Factory screw, factory everything. I just crimped on a little guy like this to the end, and she went right in there, torqued her down. And then of course your boost gauge is super easy. There's no wiring at all. You just have the one boost reference, boost and vacuum. So that's just teed into the blow-off valve circuit there, and that was just getting manifold pressure. There's a barb fitting on the other side of the intake. Super easy. So one other tip on these throttle bodies, depending on the kit you have, sometimes there's a couple of O-rings on the inside of the inlet to your manifold. You see a lot of guys putting silicone or some kind of sealant on those. So they might be prone to leaking. I couldn't tell you for sure, but my kit doesn't have any O-rings on there, so I'm good. But if yours does have O-rings, you might want to double up. And I think these are prone to leak because a lot of these manifolds don't use the factory supports anymore. So they're kind of just suspended there. There's not really a lot holding them in place. So under max load, you're probably going to get a lot of torque and movement out of those intake manifolds. So this is pretty common knowledge, but if you didn't know, Skidoo indexes their spark plugs. So what I mean by that is when you install it, you do not want this side of the spark plug blocking the flow from your power valve. So you want the open side or 90-degree sides facing the power valve. If you have the back side of this plug facing, that's gonna block the flow from your power valves and cause you fueling issues. So one of the last finishing touches here, the turbo inlet. So we're gonna have a 90 coming off the turbo there, coming straight up the center here. And like I said, I'm not a fan of this, but had to cut the stock airbox out. So this little intake tube is gonna fit in here. So we're just gonna run some self-tappers with washers and we're gonna Loctite them in. And then this is where the blow-off valve goes. So it recircs into the intake plenum. So that's supposed to purge your side vents and everything, because we all know how those get clogged up with snow pretty easy on those deep days. So I think that should work pretty well. So I like that design, like that aspect of it, but I just wish they would come up with a bolt-on piece instead of hacking up this little Y-bridge intake. So, because I'm pretty sure you can get this piece separate, but and this piece is gonna go in there, and then I got a little 90 coupler. Tight fit, but that's how she goes. Some red Loctite self-tappers. These things actually bite really well. So I was having a really hard time fitting the hood on. Had to do some last minute adjustments. I swapped this intercooler pipe around. So I have the vacuum fitting for my boost controller down on this side. It was kind of hanging out a little bit right where the intake wanted to come down. And having the wastegate and everything close to the turbo is never a bad thing either. So another thing I like to do with this exhaust wrap, if you wrap it really tight where you're starting, you don't even need a clamp on it. Once it heats up, it shrinks a little bit and it's nice and tight, nice clean look. This clamp on the bottom doesn't really look that good, but that's the only clamp I had right now. So the system with one clamp, I think always looks better than a bunch of clamps on both sides. So last piece of the turbo kit, we're trying to take the primary off. Skidoo has a holding tool that kind of goes into the primary holes here and has a big handle on it. It is nice to kind of support that while you loosen this guy, but I kind of rigged up my own holding tool. I just wrapped a tie strap around the primary, but I couldn't really get it tight enough and I didn't really want to torque on it too much and it just kept on slipping. So the answer for me, I used the same location that the Skidoo holding tool bites into. So I just clamped that in there and I ran that up to the bars and that actually worked really well. And then use your 12-point socket and she broke free pretty easy. This is torqued to 88 or 89 foot-pounds. All right, so this is an old trick. We're gonna try and put a little bit of water in the primary bolt area and I put a little bit of thread sealant or thread tape on here. And we're gonna try and hydrolock the primary to pop it off because there is another specialty tool that Skidoo has, a little puller for the primary, but this is supposed to work pretty good, so. Hopefully this is enough of an angle, holds enough of the water in. first attempt was definitely a fail. I'm gonna try putting a little bit more tape on and see if it seals a little better. So went a little heavier with the tape and tipped the sled right sideways, filled it perfectly full with water, and try her again. Still didn't work. I don't think we're getting a good seal. I'm gonna try a little bit of electrical tape or something different. Take 3, try an electrical tape. Yeah, feels pretty good. All right, so she did work there. The key is to have the sled perfectly sideways, fill it right up to the top with water, and I put on quite a bit of electrical tape so that there's some resistance going in, and you hear a pretty good pop. It almost sounds like it breaks, but it doesn't. That's just how she goes. Oh yeah. Probably have to clean this out a little bit with some brake clean, some compressed air, but and then using this ratchet strap to hold the clutch. It works, but it's up to you if you want to mess around without the specialty tools or if it's worth it to buy the specialty tools. Each to their own. And you want to be try and be careful not to scratch anything up. You don't want to wreck the belt surface where it's going to be riding. Yeah, that's her. So I'm not going to lie to you guys. The water trick works, but it kind of sucked. I tried probably 4 or 5 times before it popped off there for me. So if you don't want to screw around for a while, it might be worth buying the puller, but in a pinch, it does work without the tool. So this sled is a 2020. This is Skidoo's new P-Drive primary. So you want to make sure you mark everything. They do have a little minus here and a plus for the 2 sheave halves. And we're just going to add some extra markings here. We're going to mark everything because we're going to be taking all of this off. This rubber balancer piece, it's not going to matter because the bolts will only go in one way. They're spaced out a little bit differently, so you can't really mix that up. And there's no tension on this top half, so we're just going to pop out these T40s, and then we're going to need to compress the hub, and there's a snap ring underneath. So what actually came in the kit? These are different ramps. We got some weights for the ramps and a new primary spring. We already did the secondary. So these ramps just have a different profile, so it's going to engage a little bit differently for the turbo. So centrifugal force drives these ramps up, and they push on these rollers here. So you can see that's the factory ramp. And as these ramps push on the rollers, it drives the 2 clutch halves together to engage your belt. So you can adjust how aggressive these, with the weights, how aggressive they apply. The more weight, I think the less RPM you're gonna get out of it. I'm a pretty light rider, so we got some weight to play with. We're gonna start with 1, and we're gonna start with our adjustments on 1 as well, because we don't wanna over rev it. With the turbo, we're probably only gonna be revving to 8,000 max. All right, so disassembly here, just real quick. So we did mark the plus and the minus here, and originally I marked here and here, but they actually have an arrow as well, and it lines up with this little 0. So it's always a good idea to double up with your markings, but worst case scenario, you should be able to get it back together if you forget. So loosen off these T40 Torx bits, but don't take them all the way out. And then you can use your stock bolt or your Skidoo puller. Thread this in a little bit. And we're just gonna give it a good smack to separate this P drive. All right, so you can either just tap that with a hammer, or I took the whole clutch, flipped it upside down, and tapped it on the ground, and it worked pretty good. So I'll take this out. And now you can finish taking out all these guys. And she'll just drop right down for you. So I got my little press rigged up. I'm just compressing the outer cone and getting the snapping out. I'll release the tension. There's not that much tension, but just 2 big primary spring. Now all our ramps and weights are underneath. So this is where we're gonna take the ramp out and add the weight. This is the original screw. Here's a specialty tool for this. I just used a machine screw, and you tap the pin out the other side. So with the random screw turned in a little bit, and just give her a light tap. You will have to tap it with a hammer. Boom, just like that. So now this is going to separate, and we can change it around. Alright, so this one's back together. Do the same thing on the last 2. Even just feeling it right now with that extra weight, it's much heavier. So we're definitely only going to start with 1. And then our adjustments here, we have this on 1 as well. And obviously you want to clean everything up, all the belt dust and everything that gets in these clutches when you have them apart. My sled's only got 1,000 K on it, and it was nasty in there. Just a maintenance thing too. Make sure your clutches are clean. They'll last and work a lot better, and you'll get better performance out of them. And one last little tip. Scotch-Brite works really well just to scuff the faces of the clutch, just to clean them up, get rid of the bit of glaze that usually on them. Oh, clutching's all done, back together. Just doing some finishing touches. This is the fill and bleed for the air-to-water intercooler. So just have some coolant in there. I'll be checking it and topping it up again after it's running and get it on a little bit of a incline. Last little walk around, and then the moment you've all been waiting for. start up. See how this old girl sounds. So she's a tight fit, but it does fit. So I will get some riding footage too, but right now it's November and there's literally no snow. So anxiously waiting for that. But recap on the turbo. The kit itself is a nice kit. It took me probably 20 hours or so just messing around. It was my first time, so a lot of trial and error on a few things. The intercooler took a lot of time. If you have a turbo kit without an intercooler, it would be a lot faster. The clutching was a little bit of a pain. Honestly, if you didn't want to tackle the clutching, a shop would probably only charge you an hour or two to do that for you. It might be worth it to some people. Other than that, it was a pretty tight fitment with the inlet to the turbo and the charge pipe going to the actual intake. Did take, I probably had the hood on and off 10 times or so just to get a decent fitment. And you can see here, so the charge pipe and the actual intake pipe, they're almost touching, and they're almost touching that frame piece too. So that, a little tighter than I'd like to see, but I guess that's how it is. Could you do this at home? Definitely. I did it at home, no specialty tools, no nothing. It was a little bit of a mess around with the clutching, like I said, but if you have kind of like a homemade press, that's all you really need. So hopefully all this hard work pays off. I really want to see how it performs, but got another month or so to wait. Stay tuned for that. Hopefully I had some good info and help you along the way if you're installing a turbo kit yourself. I know I kind of got tied up with the install and didn't film some of the things I wanted to, but I think I did cover most of the little things I fought with, and that should tie up most of the loose ends for you guys.